There is a single photograph from the Pacific War that still has the power to silence a room. It shows a large Australian soldier, shirt dark with sweat and rain, straining forward under the weight of another man slung across his shoulders. The wounded soldier wears an American uniform. His head hangs limp, boots dangling inches above the jungle ground. Around them, the steep slopes of Mount Tambu rise sharply, choked with mud, vines, and unseen danger. The man carrying him is Leslie Allen, known to everyone simply as Bull. The date is July 30th, 1943. The place is New Guinea, one of the most brutal and unforgiving battlefields of the Second World War. And the moment captured in that photograph represents something far greater than a single act of bravery. It captures the instant when one man chose humanity over fear, again and again, under fire. By that point in the war, the Allied campaign in New Guinea had become a grinding nightmare. Steep, jungle-covered mountains replaced beaches and open ground. Soldiers fought not just the enemy, but disease, exhaustion, and terrain that punished every step. Rain turned paths into rivers of mud. Wounded men often lay where they fell, because reaching them meant exposing yourself to enemy machine gun fire. On Mount Tambu, American troops had been ordered to assault a well-defended Japanese position. The attack went badly. The enemy held the high ground. Machine guns raked the slopes. Mortars fell without warning. As the Americans were forced to pull back, wounded soldiers were left stranded on the hillside, crying out for help that no one could safely give. That was when Bull Allen stepped forward. He was not an infantryman. He carried no rifle. He was an Australian Army medic trained to save lives, not take them. He had already been wounded earlier in the campaign and evacuated, but had insisted on returning to the front. Big, powerfully built, and quiet by nature, Allen had earned his nickname not through aggression, but through sheer physical endurance and reliability. When he saw the wounded Americans trapped on the mountain, he did not wait for orders. He simply went up. Through Japanese fire up the muddy slope, Allen reached the first wounded soldier. He lifted him onto his shoulders and carried him down to safety. Most men would have stopped there. Allen did not. He turned around and went back up the mountain. Again, and again, and again. By the end of that day, 12 American soldiers were alive because one Australian medic refused to accept that they were beyond saving. At the time, few people realized what had happened on that jungle hillside. There was no speech, no announcement, just exhausted men, wounded survivors, and one medic who finally collapsed from sheer physical exhaustion. But that photograph, taken moments after one of those rescues, would go on to define courage not as violence, but as compassion under fire. And that is where the story of Bull Allen truly begins. While Europe burned and North Africa raged during World War II, another theater of war was unfolding in the steamy, disease-ridden jungles of the Pacific, a front that would become one of the most brutal campaigns fought by Australian troops. New Guinea. This wasn't the war of grand tank battles or air raids over cities. It was a war of mud, mountain, and malaria, fought in a place where every inch of ground came at the price of blood and exhaustion. After the fall of Singapore in 1942, Australia realized it could no longer rely solely on Britain for defense. Japanese forces were pushing south, threatening New Guinea, and eventually Australia itself. The Kokoda Track campaign had already shown how difficult jungle warfare could be. Now in 1943, Australian and American troops were engaged in a grinding series of offensives to dislodge Japanese forces from key strategic positions, including the high ridges surrounding Salamaua and Lae. One of those positions was Mount Tambu, a natural fortress towering over the jungle below, covered in slick clay, thick vegetation, and ideal defensive ground for the Japanese. It was into this nightmare terrain that the 25th Australian Infantry Battalion, supported by elements of the U.S. 32nd Infantry Division, was sent. The enemy was well dug in, their machine guns concealed in tree lines, mortars camouflaged under foliage. Every assault meant climbing uphill, under fire, with supply lines that barely functioned. Wounded men were often stranded because the slope was too steep or too exposed for stretchers. Helicopter evacuations were impossible. The only way down was on someone's back. It was here that Corporal Leslie "Bull" Allen, a 26-year-old stretcher bearer from Ballarat, found himself. Unlike most soldiers, Allen didn't carry a weapon. He carried a medic's satchel, a bandage roll, and an iron determination to save lives. He had already proven himself on the track at Wow and Mubo, known for his strength and stamina, and for his quiet, unshakable nature. On July 30th, 1943, during a combined assault on Japanese positions near Mount Tambu, U.S. troops came under intense fire and were forced to fall back. 12 wounded American soldiers were left on the slope stranded, bleeding, unable to crawl out. The situation was clear. To save them would mean almost certain death. And yet Bull Allen didn't hesitate. As mortars exploded nearby and bullets tore through leaves, he began climbing. Not once, not twice, but again and again, through gunfire, mud, and exhaustion. His actions would be remembered not just for the number of lives he saved, but for the fact that no one asked him to. He simply saw men dying and did what others couldn't or wouldn't. What made it possible? The answer lies not in his strength, but in his unshakable moral clarity, a belief that, even in the worst hell, one man could still bring others out alive. Before he became a legend in the mountains of New Guinea, Leslie Bull Allen was just a quiet boy from Ballarat, Victoria, born in 1916 into a life that was anything but easy. Growing up during the aftermath of World War I and through the Great Depression, Allen learned hardship early. His family was working class. Money was tight. Schooling was minimal. From a young age, he took jobs wherever he could: farmhand, laborer, odd jobs in tough conditions, anything that taught him how to endure and keep going when things got hard. That endurance would become his signature. He joined the Australian Army in 1940, not out of glory or ambition, but out of duty. At first, he served in a signals unit, but after showing an instinctive ability to remain calm under pressure and possessing a remarkable physical strength, he was reassigned as a stretcher bearer in the 205th Infantry Battalion. It was a role that required more than muscle. It demanded nerve, selflessness, and a tolerance for horror. And Allen had all three. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. Fellow soldiers described him as a big, quiet bloke who always carried more than his share and never complained. When others faltered, Allen picked them up, sometimes literally. He wasn't the kind of man who barked orders or delivered speeches. He simply did what needed doing, especially when things got ugly. He earned his nickname Bull, not because of rage or violence, but because of his sheer size, endurance, and quiet determination. Like a draft animal, he kept moving forward through jungle rot, enemy fire, exhaustion, and terrain that broke weaker men. Before Mount Tambu, Allen had already been wounded in action during the WOW campaign, and doctors had recommended he return to Australia to recover. He refused. Instead, he asked to rejoin his battalion. He didn't want to abandon his mates, and he believed, as he would later say in a rare interview, that being there might mean someone else gets to live. That belief became his code. As a medic, Allen saw the worst of war. Men screaming in pain, lungs torn open, limbs gone. He carried them through mud, over ridges, down cliffs, often under fire. He didn't hesitate, didn't freeze, and didn't need orders. He acted on instinct, one built from years of hardship, quiet responsibility, and deep personal courage. By the time the attack on Mount Tambu came in July 1943, Allen had already proven himself to his battalion. But it was what he did over those few critical hours, going back up that deadly hill 12 times, that revealed the full extent of who he really was. Bull Allen was never trained to fight like a hero. He was shaped to endure like one. The sound of gunfire echoed like thunder across the jungle slopes of Mount Tambu on the morning of July 30th, 1943. The combined Australian and American assault had stalled. U.S. troops from the 32nd Infantry Division had launched an uphill attack against well-entrenched Japanese positions, only to be cut down by machine gun fire and mortars before reaching their objective. The terrain was a nightmare. Steep, slippery clay, jungle foliage that hid death at every step, and heat that drained strength from even the fittest men. Wounded Americans lay scattered across the muddy slope. Some cried out for help. Others lay still, too far gone to speak. Most were pinned down and helpless, trapped between enemy fire above and the distance to friendly lines below. To go out into that killing zone was to walk into certain death. But Corporal Leslie Bull Allen didn't hesitate. With nothing more than a medic's satchel, a Red Cross armband, and an iron will, he began to climb the slope, alone, into the line of fire. He reached the first wounded soldier, slung the man over his broad shoulders, and began the treacherous descent. Enemy fire cracked around him, bullets kicked up dust at his feet. Mortar shrapnel sliced into tree trunks nearby. But Allen didn't falter. When he reached the bottom and handed off the wounded man to stretcher teams, he didn't stop to rest. He went back up. Again and again. By the fourth trip, his uniform was soaked with sweat and mud, his boots slipping on the blood-slick slope. Yet each time he crested the ridge and disappeared into the smoke, soldiers watching from below held their breath, fearing this would be the last time they saw him alive. But each time he came back with another man. One soldier was unconscious. Another had been shot in the leg. One had a collapsed lung. Allen didn't care who they were, only that they were alive and needed to get off that mountain. American soldiers on the ridge were stunned. "We thought he was done after number 5, one later recalled. Then we saw him coming back up like a damn bull through the jungle. By the time Allen carried down the 12th man, his legs buckled and he collapsed from exhaustion. He had climbed and descended a battlefield 12 times under direct fire, saving 12 lives that would almost certainly have been lost without him. He didn't do it for a medal. He didn't do it for recognition. In fact, when asked later why he had done it, Allen gave a simple answer. They were wounded. They couldn't walk. I could. On a day when the jungle was filled with screams, smoke, and suffering, Bull Allen became a symbol of pure, selfless courage, the kind of heroism that doesn't come from training, but from the heart. When Corporal Leslie Bull Allen collapsed after carrying the 12th wounded American soldier down Mount Tambu, the battlefield fell into a kind of stunned silence. There were no cheers, no applause, just quiet, the kind that comes when soldiers witness something that defies understanding. American medics rushed to Allen's side. He was drenched in sweat, his arms trembling, his uniform soaked with mud, blood, and rain. For a moment they thought he was dead from sheer exhaustion, but his eyes fluttered open, and through chapped lips he whispered, "Is that all of them?" Word spread quickly through the ranks. An Australian medic had just carried 12 of our men out of hell. Among the American troops, awe gave way to disbelief and then to quiet admiration. Many of the wounded would later ask who had carried them. A few would meet Bull Allen in person days or weeks later, often too emotional to speak. One reportedly cried and simply said, "You gave me my life back." Allen's own comrades in the 205th Australian Infantry Battalion were equally stunned, but not entirely surprised. They had seen Bull in action before. They had watched him carry stretchers through gunfire and scale cliffs with a man on his back. But even for them, what happened on Mount Tambu was beyond anything they had witnessed. "He just kept going," one fellow soldier said. "Each time we thought, this is it. He won't make it back down." But he did. 12 bloody times. Yet Allen never boasted. When asked about it later, he was famously quiet. He didn't like being called a hero. He didn't want to talk about what he'd seen or the weight he carried both on his back and in his mind. "I just did my job," he'd say. But for the men around him, it was more than a job. It was a moment of hope in a war that offered very little. It was a reminder that even in the worst of circumstances, amid bullets, mud, and death, compassion could survive. Even commanders, normally focused on maps and objectives, paused to acknowledge what had happened. One American officer reportedly said, "If I could have one man like that in every platoon, I'd take the Pacific by Christmas." Later that month, Allen would be nominated for both Australian and U.S. military honors. But on the day of his act, there were no medals, no cameras except for the one that captured that now famous photograph of him with a soldier over his shoulders. What lingered that day was something far more powerful than ceremony. It was respect, silent, shared, and deeply felt among men who had seen one of their own rise above fear and carry others to safety when no one else would. In the weeks following the Battle of Mount Tambu, Corporal Leslie Bull Allen's story began to ripple through American ranks. Reports of the Australian medic who had braved enemy fire 12 times to save wounded U.S. soldiers reached the top brass and quickly spread beyond. The United States Army awarded him the Silver Star, one of its highest honors for gallantry in action. The citation praised his exceptional bravery and disregard for personal safety. Photos of Allen carrying American wounded were circulated among war correspondents and published in military newsletters. Even the First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, personally sent him a handwritten letter expressing the gratitude of the American people. But back in Australia, the response was muted. Though he had previously received the military medal for earlier campaigns, Bull Allen was not given any additional award for his actions on Mount Tambu. The reasoning at the time was bureaucratic. His actions were seen as part of his medical duties, not combat valor. No medals for courage under fire, no promotion, no official fanfare. The American Silver Star stood alone on his record. Why the difference? Part of it lay in Australian military culture, especially during World War II. There was a deep-seated discomfort with individual glory. Bravery was expected, not celebrated. The so-called tall poppy syndrome, a social attitude where individuals who stand out are cut down, was very much alive. To many in command, Allen was just doing his job. To make too much of it would have been un-Australian. And Allen, he never complained. But the war left its mark in ways no medal could cover. When Bull Allen returned to civilian life, the wounds he carried weren't visible, but they were deep. He struggled with what we now know as PTSD at a time when the condition was barely understood. According to family accounts, he spent nearly 6 months in near total silence after discharge, barely speaking to anyone, even those closest to him. He would sometimes disappear into the bush alone for days. Loud noises startled him. The sight or smell of blood triggered episodes of panic. His once booming presence was replaced by a withdrawn, haunted quiet. Eventually, the military medically discharged him for psychological instability. The same man who had walked into fire 12 times to save others was left to battle his demons alone. He took odd jobs, lived simply, avoided attention. He rarely spoke of the war, even when asked. And when people called him a hero, he would shake his head and say, "I was just a medic." But those who served with him knew better. They remembered not just the man who saved lives, but the one who paid the price for doing so. For decades after the war, Corporal Leslie Bull Allen lived in quiet obscurity. He returned to Ballarat, worked a series of low-profile jobs, and faded into civilian life as so many veterans did. Without fanfare, without closure, and without the support systems modern soldiers might expect. The war stayed with him, carved into his memory like shrapnel. But his story, it faded from public consciousness. In America, the story lived longer. The Silver Star citation, the letter from Eleanor Roosevelt, and the image of the massive Australian carrying a wounded U.S. soldier had made rounds through military newsletters, coffee table books, and even history textbooks. Among some American veterans, that Australian who saved 12 men became a legend whispered with gratitude. But in Australia, Bull Allen's name was barely mentioned. No parades, no documentaries, no classroom lessons. His war story, like that of many others, was swallowed by the long national silence that followed the trauma of the Pacific Campaign. It wasn't until decades later, when historians began re-examining the lesser-known contributions of Australian troops in the Pacific Theater, that his image resurfaced. That image, the black and white photograph taken during the rescues at Mount Tambu, became a catalyst. Reprinted in books, articles, and exhibitions, the photo captured something raw and human. It showed no blood, no flag, no victory, just a man carrying another through hell. His face was strained but focused. His back was bent but unbroken. The image didn't glorify war. It revealed its cost and its compassion. Suddenly, people started asking, who was he? What happened to him? As the photo re-entered public awareness, so did Allen's story. Veterans groups lobbied for his recognition. Historians published accounts of Mount Tambu. His surviving comrades came forward with interviews, describing the day Bull Allen went up that mountain again and again. In 1997, more than 50 years after the battle, Bull Allen was honored during commemorations in Ballarat. Small, heartfelt ceremonies took place at military museums and Anzac memorials. His story began to be taught in schools as an example of quiet Australian heroism, not loud, not boastful, but unshakably decent. Yet through it all, Allen himself remained mostly silent. He died in 1982, never having embraced the fame, never seeking the spotlight. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a soldier who had a job to do and men who needed saving. But the photograph he left behind told a different story. Bull saved 12 American lives that day. 12 men who went home after the war, 12 men who had families, children, grandchildren. Bull Allen may have faded from view in his lifetime, but history, as it often does, caught up. And when it did, it found a man who defined the best of us, without ever asking to.